Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli out here in the shop with another great one for you today. And as far as questions go, probably the most asked question I get, the best question I've had of all times is, what is the best bass lure ever created? What's the best bass lure out there? And man, that's a hard one to answer when you look at the spectrum of lures that are available, right? From soft baits to hard baits to spinner baits and jigs and swim baits, and there's so many categories. So when I thought about this, what's the best bass lure ever created? What's the best bass lure out there? You have to factor in a lot of stuff into your answer before you answer it. So you have to factor in seasonality. If I'm trying to pick one lure, the best bass lure ever created, what is one that works in every seasonal condition, right? What's a lure that works in the coldest temperatures of the winter, in the warming temperatures of the spring, in the heat of the summer, the hottest water of the year, in the cooling waters of the fall, back to the winter, right? What's a lure that can go all four seasons? Another question you have to ask yourself is, what is one lure that can go through all of the water conditions that are out there, right? And when you talk about conditions of the water, there's a lot of them. A lure that's good in dirty water, a lure that's good in stained water, a bass lure that's good in ultra clear water. What about watertight, right? Reservoirs, ponds, lakes, rivers, streams. Man, there's so many different water types. So what's a bass lure that can transcend all of those different types of water? And the last question you have to ask yourself when picking the best bass lure ever created is, what is a lure, what is the one lure that you can fish a lot of different ways, right? Not just on the bottom, not just on the surface, not just in the middle, but all of it, right? What's a bass lure that you can fish crawling on the bottom, hopping off the bottom, swimming through the middle, popping across the top? What's one lure that covers all of those? So this isn't an easy answer, but after all of that, I'm here to tell you the best bass lure ever created is the skirted jig. The skirted jig has to get the nod for the best bass lure ever created. And this is not a new lure, right? This is not something that just came out or even came out 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. This lure is as old as bass fishing, right? I think this lure really gained popularity in the 70s, but there were probably versions of a skirted jig even before that, right? Bucktails have been around forever, sort of a version of this. But at its core, a skirted jig is a weighted head, a lead or a tungsten head with skirt material just below that head, right on the top of the shank of the hook, silicone, living rubber, whatever that skirt material is, and of course then your hook. A lot of these skirted jigs come with a fiber guard attached, and that fiber guard is great because it makes it weedless and snagless, which makes this even better as the best bass lure ever created. So my answer to this long asked question, what's the best bass lure ever created? It's a skirted jig, okay? But there's a lot of them out there, but in particular, this is one of my favorites. This is a jig by Missile called the Flip Out, and this is a full-sized jig. And it really is the most versatile lure in my tackle box. I want to talk a little bit about plugging in answers to those questions that we had about seasonality, about water type, and about how to fish it. And as I do that, I'm going to throw in some little tips and secrets and modifications that I make, okay? So the first one is this jig, this skirted jig, goes through all 4 seasons, right? In the coldest part of the year, in the winter, I can fish a jig ultra slow on the bottom. As the water warms up, I could hop it quicker. When the fish are on beds, I could throw it on a bed. In the heat of the summer, I could flip it in thick vegetation. I could fish it over deep humps. In the fall, when they're chasing bait, I could swim it real high, put a white one on and swim it real high. I could swim it through standing timber. So it goes through all 4 seasons. But when I pick my trailers on this, and by the way, 99.9% of the time, pretty much all the time, I never fish this skirted jig without a trailer. But for sure, there are 2 general types that I fish. And I want to show this to you. In the colder months, when you're picking a trailer for your skirted jig, pick a trailer that has a very neutral action. I wouldn't call it no action, but a fluid neutral action. So colder water, you know, in the 30s up to about 60 degrees, I love a chunk on the back of that skirted jig. This is one of my favorites. This is a Max Scent a power chunk. And one of the neat things about this chunk is it can help you with the shape of that bait as well. So this one chunk, I can make the profile of that jig bigger or smaller. So again, chunk, let's pick a chunk style trailer when the water's cooler. 60 degrees, mid-50s or cooler, I want a chunk. But if I want to keep a small, compact profile with this skirted jig, and I want to use that cool water chunk, I'm going to thread this chunk on the jig, okay? So pull my skirting material back, and I could also get my scissors if I want a smaller profile, and I could just cut some of this skirt material back closer to the bend of the hook, and I'm making a smaller profile, right? Another great reason why this is the best bass lure of all time. I can modify it. But if I want a compact profile, I'm going to take that Max Scent chunk and I'm actually just going to thread it through the fat part of that chunk all the way up to that 360 lure keeper on that missile jig. And now I have a jig that has a very neutral fluid trailer, but it's small and compact. But what about those times when you want a big, full profile jig, right? Now you're imitating bluegill or tilapia, or you're seeing crawfish on the bottom that look like little lobsters, right? Cold water, right? Cooler water, but now I want a big profile. I don't cut that skirt back. I leave it full size, and I'm actually going to just punch this chunk on. And when I do that, when I just punch it through the middle of that fat, look at how much length it adds to that jig, okay? But before I do that, I want to show you something. Another little trick for this best bass lure of all times is to get a better hookup. The one problem with punching your chunk, right, just punching your chunk through the middle, is that length of hook exposed, right? Look at it. That chunk likes to move around, and occasionally when it moves, it'll turn on itself, and look what happens. You see it hooked itself? You're going to lose about 20% of your bites when it does that. So if I'm using a chunk in the full profile, punched through the fat, I use a spacer. And one of the great things about saving your old plastics is I don't have to waste the lure. This is a Berkley Powerbait General. You can see it's caught like 30 fish on it. It's all beat up. I put these in a little box. I save them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut about 1 inch to 1.25 inches of that stick bait down. So I just cut that down. There's about 1 inch of stick bait. It was already broken, doesn't matter. And I take that broken stick worm and I'm going to thread it on the body of that hook. And when I do that, you can see, look at that. It adds a spacer. It closes the gap on that hook. So now, when I take that chunk in that cooler water, right? Cooler water, 60 degrees or less, fluid neutral action. Now when I punch it through the center of that chunk, look at this. I still have that long profile, but now that chunk can't turn on itself. Look, it can't get back in that gap. And I land those 20% of those fish that I would have missed, okay? So jig's great all 4 seasons. I want you to use a chunk when that water's cooler, but when the water's warmer, I want you to use a trailer that has more action. I love a double tail grub. I love a single tail grub on the back of that skirted jig. But when that water gets warmer, I want you to pick a trailer that has some action to it. And one of my favorites is a Berkley Chigger Crawl. This is a 4-inch Berkley Chigger Crawl. And just like the chunk, I can either have a big profile or a small profile by using this 4-inch Chigger Crawl, okay? So Chigger Crawl, more action to the trailer when the water's warmer. So for the chunk, we said 60 degrees or cooler, a fluid chunk. Now we're saying 60 degrees or warmer. I want a trailer that has action. Double tail grub or a crawl, perfect. A lot of action. So post-spawn, summertime, early fall, water that's 65, 70, 80, 90 degrees, action trailer. If I want this jig to have a big profile, I don't cut the skirt. I leave the skirt full size out of the pack. And when I thread on that 4-inch Chigger Crawl, I don't modify that Chigger Crawl at all. I just thread it on. I want it thread on so the flat side is on the bottom. And when I do that, I have a big profile, big crawl arms. Look at it. Once again, matching the hatch. If the bluegill are big, the tilapia, the crawfish, whatever you're trying to imitate, the crabs coming up the river, if they're big, full size. Leave the skirt. Leave the Chigger Crawl full size. But just like the chunk, if my 4-inch is small, the bite's tough. I want to make this more compact. I take it out of the pack. I get my scissors. I can cut that skirt all the way back to the bend of the hook. And then I'm going to get my Chigger Crawl and I'm going to cut this down. I really like to cut 2 segments off it. I count it. 1, 2. That's about 3/4 of an inch of it I take off. And it gives me enough meat to still thread it. But now watch when I thread this 4-inch Chigger Crawl on this flip out jig. Watch this. Ready? Look how much I shortened up the profile. Look at it. Now it's small. Now it's compact, right? So I can dial this bait in. Once again, one of the reasons it's so good. All 4 seasons, different kinds of trailers, very versatile, right? Being able to modify it. Let's get to the second group. We talked about why this jig is so good in different water conditions. And it really, really is. A jig is great in clear water. I could go to a more natural skirt, like a green pumpkin, a watermelon. If the water's stained, I can go to a brown, a black and brown. I can go to a white if I'm trying to imitate shad. Or if the water's dirty, I can go to dirty watercolors like black. This one right here is called Superbug. It's black with a little bit of bright green pumpkin in it. So these jigs are the best bass lure ever created because they work in every water clarity out there. Last but not least, the skirted jig is the best because of the ways you can fish it. And I'll give you my top 4 ways that I fish this jig, and I want to throw in one last modification for you. And here they go. A jig fished on the bottom, slow and low, is undeniably one of the best ways to catch them when fish are relating to the bottom. That jig, as you crawl it, it gets through anything, rock, grass, over wood. It's pretty snagless. And when I'm dragging it on the bottom, my rule is when I feel it hit something, if I'm dragging, stop, drag, stop. But if I hit something, if I feel it contact something, I stop it. And one of the great things about a skirted jig, if you're using living rubber or silicone, whatever that skirt material is, when you stop it, you're not moving it, right? The skirt is still breathing. And that looks real. It looks like a crawfish posturing in defensive position. It looks like a bluegill puffing its gills out, right? So it's moving even when you stop it. So number 1, slow and low on the bottom. Number 2, this skirted jig is perfect for a retrieve called snapping or ripping a jig, stroking a jig, they call it. And basically this one, I'm dragging it on the bottom, but about every, foot of the drag, I snap my rod tip up. And I do it with the rod and the reel. So as I drag, about every foot, I'll just pop it. And I'll actually pop my rod up and reel, put a reel turn into it. And what that does is it makes it jump off the bottom and fall back down rapidly. Jump off the bottom, fall back down rapidly. I can create a reaction strike with this jig from fish that aren't actively feeding, right? Another reason this is the best bass lure ever created. Number 3 for me with a skirted jig is swimming the jig medium retrieve. And I love swimming a jig when fish are suspended in the middle of the water column, right? A lot like a crankbait, but the great thing about a jig versus a crankbait, it's subtle. There's no rattle, there's no noise, there's not a bill, there's not treble hooks. It's just nice and subtle, coming through the middle of the water column. And when fish are suspended in trees, suspended around docks, suspended around bridge pilings, around bluff walls, you can count this jig down to the fish and just swim it. That's technique number 3. And the last technique for me is swimming it, but burning it on the top and popping my rod tip. So I could actually take the same jig that did all that other stuff we talked about, go to a lighter head size, switch from the 1/2 or 3/4 ounce, go to a 3/8 or even a 1/4, a lighter head size, keep my rod tip high, reel fast, and pop. And you can do this around cover or even in open water, and the jig will actually run just under the surface, and it'll actually pop out of the surface once in a while. And I could use this jig as a topwater. I can't tell you how many ways you can fish this jig. There are so many more ways, and it's another reason it's the best bass lure ever created. One last tip is with this fiber guard that comes standard on most of these skirted jigs. And I'm actually going to take my trailer off here so I can show you. I like to modify this weed guard depending on the cover conditions. So if you look at it, on this missile flip out, we have the perfect angle of that weed guard. And it's pretty full. It's a 30 strand full-bodied weed guard. And when that cover is ultra thick, the nastiest grass, docks with ropes and cables and standing timber with branches everywhere, I don't do a thing to that weed guard. I leave it. But if that cover is more sparse, if there's just a stick up here or there, or the grass is just short and scattered, I will thin out that fiber guard a little bit. And basically what I do is I'll take about 30% of that guard, and I pinch it between my thumb and my index finger. I take about 30% of that guard, just grab it, doesn't have to be perfect, and I get my scissors and I make an angled cut about halfway down that guard, okay? So I've taken about 30% of the thickness out of it when that cover is more sparse. So what I did, now I still have that guard to protect it around that sparse cover, but now I've taken the thickness out of it. The last modification, last scenario is you're fishing the jig in open water. There is nothing to snag on. There's no grass, there's no sticks, timber, brush. The water, it's open water, right? You're swimming it, you're stroking it, there's nothing to snag on. Now, I'm going to take that 30% out, but I'm also going to cut the length down of that fiber guard. And if you look, that fiber guard runs about 1/8 of an inch past the point of that jig. And if there's no cover where I'm fishing, I'm going to get my scissors and I'm going to take that 1/8 of an inch off. And now the fiber guard is right at the point of the hook. And all those modifications are just giving you a better ratio when that fish eats it and you set the hook. I hope you enjoyed this episode of In the Shop. We're talking about the best bass lure ever created, and it is a skirted jig. Listen, if you like what you're hearing, if you like these In the Shop episodes, stop right now, hit that subscribe button. We're going to get brand new educational content to you every single week. If you're already subscribed, do me a favor and tell your fishing friend about Mike Iaconelli Fishing on YouTube. We're going to help make them a better angler. Good luck, good fishing. Try a skirted jig.